I deal with a lot of terrible cases on this channel, but some of the most disturbing for me personally are crimes committed against children. It's the stuff of nightmares. One particularly horrific nightmare took place in Melbourne, Australia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This is the story of MrCruel. As I said in the introduction, the backdrop for the crimes that I'm about to relate to you was Melbourne, Australia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Melbourne was a vibrant city and was considered by most people to be very, very safe with a low crime rate, and it was somewhere great to bring up your children. But on the 22nd of August 1987, things were about to change in a very dark way. In a suburb of Melbourne called Lower Plenty, a man dressed in a balaclava helmet to hide his identity broke into a suburban house. He did this by removing a window pane downstairs to gain entry to the house. Now, on this particular occasion, I can't tell you the name of the victim because the family's name has been withheld. But what I can give you is the details of the crime. The man was armed with a handgun and a knife, and once he'd gained entry to the house, he went upstairs, first of all, to the parents' bedroom. He awoke the parents and told them to remain calm. He then used tape to bind them, both their hands and their feet, and he also gagged them so they couldn't make any noise. He told them that he'd just broken into the house looking for money, and if they didn't try to take any action against him, nobody would get hurt. And once he had bound and gagged them, he locked them in the wardrobe, and by this stage their 6-year-old son had also woken up. He took the boy back to his bedroom and tied him to the bed and also gagged him so he could make no sound. But what this masked intruder had told the parents was an absolute lie. He was not there for the money. He proceeded to cut the telephone lines, and after he'd secured both the parents and their 6-year-old son, he went to their 11-year-old daughter's bedroom. This was why he'd really come to the house. There would be later conjecture that he'd been watching this family for some time and he'd planned this night. And what happened afterwards is such a heinous crime, it really pains me to tell you. He went into the bedroom of the 11-year-old daughter, and then for the next 2 hours he raped her again and again and again. This man was so brazen that after he had finished inflicting this terrible ordeal on the 11-year-old daughter, he actually went to the family kitchen and cooked himself something to eat. After that, he left the house, just pausing to steal a couple of items on his way, which was a couple of vinyl records or LPs. Now, eventually the parents managed to escape and the police were contacted and an investigation was soon underway, but there were no immediate or obvious suspects. On the face of it, to police, they thought they had someone who knew exactly what he was doing. There were no clues and no forensic evidence, nothing to lead them to anyone. The man was also described both by the parents and by the daughter as being completely calm and confident, and this led police to fear that it might not be the first crime he's committed and it wouldn't be the last. One clue that did arise, and this was from evidence given by the daughter, was that she heard the man, it seems, on the telephone, threatening someone else. However, on further investigation afterwards, the police couldn't find any record in the telephone bills of this call. And so they concluded it might have been a red herring to try and throw them off the scent. A word did spread about what had gone on through this suburb of Melbourne, and obviously this terrified people. However, after this, everything seemed to go quiet, and nothing would happen for another year. And naturally, this was a great relief to police and the people of Melbourne. But that relief would be short-lived. On the 27th of December 1988, the man struck again. And this time, the crime would be escalated. At about 5:20 a.m, he broke into another house in a place called Ringwood, another suburb of Melbourne. Again, the man was shrouded in a balaclava helmet hiding his identity, and he was armed with a handgun. On this particular occasion, a man called John Wills was fast asleep in his bed, but he was awoken by something cold and hard being pressed against his head. He quickly realised that this was a handgun, and he was told by the man holding the gun not to try to be a hero. But once again, the man bound and gagged the parents and told them he was just in the house looking for money. But yet again, this was a cruel lie. The man again went and cut the telephone lines and made his way looking around the house. Pretty soon he arrived at the children's bedroom where the children were sleeping. Now inside this room there were 5-year-old Annette, 8-year-old twins Robin and Linda, and 10-year-old Sharon Wills, and it would appear that Sharon was his target on this particular occasion. Now, whether or not it was instrumental in him knowing the family, but they'd been in local newspapers after suffering a house fire, and so he even knew Sharon's name. And so he grabbed her, put tape over her eyes and a ball gag in her mouth, and then he took her from the house. He abducted her. Now, after he'd left with 10-year-old Sharon, the parents eventually managed to get out of their restraints, and they ran to the children's bedroom, and they were horrified when they saw that Sharon was missing. I can't even begin to think what went through the parents' minds. Police launched an immediate search of the neighbourhood. They were joined by neighbours and people living around the area, but there was no trace of Sharon. Sharon's parents and family went through a gruelling 18-hour period, not knowing what had happened to Sharon. But eventually they got some news. A woman was walking by Bayswater High School, and she saw what seemed to be a figure wrapped in green bin bags. Naturally, she went over to investigate, and she found a 10-year-old little girl. It was Sharon. Thankfully, she was still alive, although she had been through a terrible ordeal. When police interviewed Sharon and investigated the matter further, it would seem that she'd been through the same thing that the previous 11-year-old girl had been through. For the 18 hours that she'd been held captive, she survived unimaginable violations, suffering repeated assaults and ongoing abuse. Now, police tried to get some inkling from her as to the identity of the man, but she couldn't help them in this because she said she'd been blindfolded the entire time. But what she did tell police was that despite the terrible things that this man did to her, let's remember that like the 11-year-old prior to her, this man raped her multiple times. He had been kind and softly spoken, in her opinion. She said he'd almost treated her in a very gentle way, other than the abuse that he inflicted on her. He'd even given her something to eat. She said it was a Vegemite sandwich, which, if you're not familiar with that, is like Marmite in the UK. So after abusing her, he'd given her something to eat. He even gave her some lemonade to drink. And then, very strangely, he bathed her. Now, this was probably to try and get rid of any forensic evidence that might link him to the crime and the abduction. He'd also clipped her fingernails and her toenails. Again, this might be because she might have had some sort of forensic evidence like DNA under her fingernails, so he was trying to get rid of that. The trail went cold yet again, and it would be some time until this monster reared his ugly head. But in the meantime, it had taken its toll on the Wills family. They were terrified about anything happening to their children again. They all slept in the same room, and a local person even gifted them a dog to try and protect the family. And by this time, the perpetrator of these heinous crimes had earned himself a nickname. This had come from the Sun newspaper, which had been monitoring and reporting on the crimes. They nicknamed him MrCruel, and that's what he became known as. During the period leading up to the next crime, police had very little to go on. As I said, Sharon said she was blindfolded the entire time. She just gave them vague descriptions of how the man acted. But one thing she did say was that wherever she was kept, and she didn't know where that was, she could hear aircraft overhead, which kind of narrowed things down a little bit because there was a local airport, but police had no more than that to go on. And as I say, everything then went quiet up until the 3rd of July 1990. The next crime occurred in another suburb of Melbourne called Canterbury, which was a very well-to-do and wealthy neighbourhood. Quite a lot of local politicians lived there. This time, MrCruel's target was the Linus family. The parents were Brian and Rosemary Linus, and they had two daughters, Fiona, aged 15, and Nicola, aged 13. Yet again, this suburb of Melbourne, because of the people that lived there, the politicians and well-to-do people, was considered particularly safe. And on this particular night, Brian and Rosemary had gone out to a party, leaving their daughters at home alone. Eventually the two girls fell asleep, but around about midnight they were awoken. MrCruel had broken into the house and he was shouting orders at them. Once again, he was armed with a knife and a gun, so the girls were completely powerless to fight back or do anything. Now, one of the things that MrCruel said was that he told Nicola to go and fetch her school uniform, and while she did this, he proceeded to tie her older sister Fiona up. Now, in the process of tying Fiona up, he told her that she had to memorise a message. She would have to tell her parents when they got home that they'd have to pay $25,000 to get their other daughter back from him. And when he'd done this and Nicola had returned with her school uniform, he dragged her out of the house to Brian's car, which was sat on the driveway. Now, this was in fact a hire car because the Linus family were from Britain and they were due to leave Australia to go back in a few days' time. He bundled Nicola into the car and drove off with her. Now, a short while later, Brian and Rosemary would return from the party, and immediately they noticed something suspicious because their hire car was missing from the driveway. Eventually they would go into the house and find Fiona bound and gagged, and of course they knew something terrible had happened and alerted the police straight away. Now, Fiona told her parents what the man had said about demanding money, but he'd not left any contact details. He hadn't said how he was going to get this money or how he would make contact with her, which was all very strange. Police would later think this again was just a red herring, because this man was in fact a child rapist. He wasn't after money. Now, what in fact had happened is that MrCruel had driven Nicola another property somewhere, we don't know where, and he had raped her multiple times and generally abused her for a total of 50 hours. Now, after this, he'd actually dropped her off just a short way from where she lived. But unlike Sharon Wills, this time she was fully clothed and wrapped in a blanket. He dropped her off by the side of the road, still blindfolded, and told her to stay there and keep her blindfold on until she heard him go away, and this she did. Now, the place he'd dropped her off was near a power substation in a place called Kew. After she heard him drive away, Nicola took off her blindfold and ran to a nearby house and alerted the people there, and she was quickly reunited with her parents. Again, because she'd been blindfolded for the entire experience, she couldn't give any real information to police. But strangely, like Sharon Wills, she said that wherever she'd been taken, she did hear aircraft overhead. So on the face of it, it seems he might have taken her to the same place as when he abducted Sharon Wills. Nicola thought she might have got a slight peek at the man through her blindfold, and he might have had ginger hair, but she couldn't be certain. So once again, police had little or no evidence to go on. But there were similarities. In the same way as Sharon Wills, Nicola had been bathed and had her toenails and fingernails clipped by MrCruel. But as if these crimes weren't bad enough, terrible abuse of children, things were going to get worse. We go now to the 13th of April 1991 in a place called Templestowe. Now, this time MrCruel had targeted the Chan family. The parents of this family were John and Phyllis Chan. They were restaurateurs. They owned 3 restaurants and some other businesses as well. Now, I've worked in the hospitality industry myself, and as I know, restaurant hours are long and hard. Quite often they would work 18-hour days, and this meant that their 13-year-old daughter, Carmaine Chan, quite often babysat for her younger siblings. Now, that night, between about 8:40 p.m. and 9 p.m, a man wearing a balaclava mask broke into the house. Now, at this time, Carmaine and her siblings had gone into the kitchen to make some food, but they were confronted by this masked man. The man threatened them with a knife, and again it was the same old story. He told them he just wanted money, and indeed he coerced Carmaine to show him where there was some money in the house, which he took. He then grabbed her siblings, Carly and Karen, and threw them into a cupboard, and he pushed a bed up against the cupboard doors to make sure they couldn't get out. He then proceeded to abduct Carmaine, but before he went, he spray painted some very strange messages on the Chan's car. And the messages read, "More to come" and "Payback." Yet again, there was a complete dearth of evidence, little or nothing left at the scene to lead police to the perpetrator of this crime. A press conference was subsequently held, and Carmaine's parents pleaded for the man who had abducted their daughter to return her safely. But regrettably, this did not happen. And the trail went cold again, and MrCruel seemed to go undercover. Months and months and months would pass by with no sign of Carmaine Chan. And it was on the 9th of April, nearly a year later, that Carmaine would be found. A man was walking his dog in the locality. He stumbled upon something that he didn't know what it was, but when he bent down and touched it, he was horrified to find that it was Carmaine's remains. Naturally, after a year, her lifeless body was badly decomposed. But forensic examination would show that she had 3 gunshot wounds to the back of her head. Now, we still don't know to this day what prompted MrCruel to take Carmaine's life as opposed to just abducting her like the other girls. There's a possibility that she may have seen him and knew his identity, so he couldn't take any chances. But the fact remains that he brutally murdered the girl. And that appeared to be the final crime that was attributed to MrCruel, but the investigation went on. In May of 1991, police set up the so-called Spectrum Task Force to concentrate on catching MrCruel. Some 30,000 homes were searched and investigated, and some 27,000 suspects were interviewed. Now, this was probably the largest investigation in Melbourne history and cost a staggering almost 4 million Australian dollars. But unfortunately, no light was shed on the identity of MrCruel. Now, the task force was disbanded in January 1994, but not before investigating other sexually motivated crimes which had a similar modus operandi. But again, nothing led to the identity of MrCruel. In December 2010, a further task force, Task Force Apollo, was set up, and police said this was based on new intelligence they had received. But regrettably, this task force would also be disbanded. Now, in 2013, suspicion did fall on a convicted child serial rapist. This man was Robert Knight, but he actually committed suicide. Police would later say that based on the evidence they found, they did not believe that Robert Knight was MrCruel. And so, again, that led nowhere. Now, in 2016, on the 25th anniversary of Carmaine's abduction and murder, the police reopened the investigation and offered a reward of $100,000 for any information leading to the conviction of MrCruel. And there was also a further $200,000 reward still in place because of the previous abductions. But all I can tell you is, in spite of these sizable rewards, no further information came forward. And to date, MrCruel has never been found. So the terrible reality of this situation is that there could still be a man out there who will be probably quite old by now, who committed these terrible, terrible crimes. The abduction and rape and sexual molestation of young girls, and then the abduction and the cold clinical murder of Carmaine Chan. One can only hope, and it would be my hope, that before this man dies, some sort of evidence might come to light to link him to the crimes, and that he will eventually be caught and incarcerated, and that justice for these young girls will be done. And on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe, and I'll thank you for watching.